2nd February 1943, Northern Pocket, Stalingrad. The silence was more terrifying than the gunfire. Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller stood in what had once been a factory warehouse, now a tomb of twisted steel and frozen corpses. Around him, the remnants of his battalion, 19 men out of the 800 who had marched into Stalingrad 5 months ago, sat motionless against the ice-covered walls. They weren't sleeping. Sleep meant death now. They simply stared with hollow eyes at nothing, too weak to speak, too exhausted to care. Outside, Soviet loudspeakers blared surrender appeals in German, the voices echoing through empty streets where no one remained to fight. Müller looked down at his hands. His left glove had rotted away weeks ago. The fingers beneath were black, dead tissue that no longer responded to his commands. He'd stopped feeling pain 3 days earlier. The nerves had frozen and died. In his right hand, he still gripped his Luger pistol, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd fired it. 1 bullet remained in the chamber. He'd saved it, though he told himself he didn't know why. But he did know. Everyone knew. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to -43 degrees Celsius. The wind screamed through shattered windows like the dying breath of an entire army. In the distance, a single gunshot cracked through the frozen air. Then another. Then silence again. The nightmare was ending, not with glory or heroism, but with quiet surrender to the cold that had killed more Germans than all of Stalin's soldiers combined. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from? And could you have endured what these men suffered in the frozen hell of Stalingrad? The German Sixth Army wasn't supposed to be in Stalingrad when winter came. According to every plan, every timeline, every confident assessment made by Wehrmacht High Command, the battle should have been over by October. The city would fall. The Volga would be crossed. German forces would drive south into the oil-rich Caucasus before the first snowfall. By Christmas, soldiers would be celebrating victory in warm barracks, writing letters home about their conquest of Stalin's namesake city. Instead, Christmas 1942 found them dying in frozen ruins, eating sawdust bread and boiled leather, watching their friends freeze to death in the night. The reality was far more brutal than anyone had anticipated, and the horror was only beginning. The campaign had begun with such promise. In late July 1942, Adolf Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 45, splitting Army Group South into 2 massive forces. Army Group A would drive toward the Caucasus oil fields at Baku, the lifeblood of the Soviet war machine. Army Group B, spearheaded by General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army, would capture Stalingrad and secure the Wehrmacht's northern flank along the Volga River. It seems straightforward. After all, the Sixth Army was one of Germany's finest formations, 270,000 battle-hardened veterans who had crushed Soviet resistance at Kharkov, who had marched across hundreds of kilometers of Soviet territory with the confidence of conquerors. Paulus himself was a capable, methodical officer, a former staff planner who had helped orchestrate the invasion of Poland. His forces included elite units, the 71st Infantry Division, the 389th Infantry Division, the 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions with their Mark III and Mark IV tanks, and full Luftwaffe support from Fliegerkorps 8. Behind them came supply columns stretching back over 1,000 kilometers to Germany, a logistical marvel that kept hundreds of thousands of men fed, armed, and mobile across the vast Russian steppe. On 23 August 1942, the Sixth Army reached the Volga River north of Stalingrad. That same day, the Luftwaffe launched the most concentrated bombing attack of the Eastern Front. Over 600 aircraft, Junkers Ju-37 Stuka dive bombers, Heinkel He-111 medium bombers, and Dornier Do-17s attacked in waves throughout the afternoon and evening. They dropped more than 1,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs on a city built largely of wood. The resulting firestorm consumed entire districts. Flames rose hundreds of meters into the air, visible from 50 kilometers away. The Volga River itself seemed to burn as ruptured oil storage tanks spilled their contents into the water. In a single day, approximately 40,000 civilians died. Men, women, children, and elderly burned alive or suffocated in cellars as firestorms consumed the oxygen. Survivors emerged from shelters to find their city transformed into an apocalyptic landscape of ash, rubble, and twisted metal. But they didn't flee. Stalin had issued Order Number 227, not one step back, and the NKVD security forces enforced it ruthlessly. Civilians who tried to evacuate across the Volga were turned back at gunpoint. Workers in the tractor factories, which had been converted to produce T-34 tanks, continued working even as German artillery shells fell around them. Women dug anti-tank ditches with hand tools. Children carried ammunition to the front lines. The entire city became a fortress, and everyone in it became a defender. The German ground assault began immediately after the bombing. Panzer spearheads crashed through Soviet defensive positions on the city's outskirts. Infantry followed, clearing bunkers and trenches with grenades and flamethrowers. The Germans expected to reach the city center within days, maybe a week. Soviet forces were disorganized, outnumbered, and reeling from the bombing. Victory seemed inevitable.
But Stalingrad refused to fall. What the Germans failed to understand was that the Luftwaffe bombing, while devastating, had transformed Stalingrad into the perfect defensive terrain. Every collapsed building became a fortress. Every pile of rubble became cover for snipers and machine gun nests. Streets were blocked by debris, forcing German tanks into predictable routes where Soviet anti-tank guns waited. The city had become a three-dimensional maze where conventional military advantages, armor, artillery, air support, meant little. General Vasily Chuikov, who took command of the Soviet 62nd Army defending Stalingrad on 12 September 1942, recognized this immediately. Chuikov was a tough, pragmatic veteran who had survived the Russian Civil War and Stalin's military purges through a combination of competence and political awareness. He understood that fighting the Germans in open terrain was suicide. Their combined arms tactics were too effective, their coordination too precise. But in close-quarters urban combat, those advantages evaporated. Chuikov issued a simple, brutal directive: hug the Germans. Soviet soldiers were ordered to stay within grenade-throwing distance of enemy positions at all times. This prevented German artillery and Luftwaffe bombers from providing support without hitting their own troops. It forced combat into close hand-to-hand range where Soviet numerical superiority in desperation could offset German training and equipment. The result was a style of warfare unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. Battles lasted days for single buildings. The grain elevator, a massive concrete structure near the river, was defended by a small Soviet garrison for 5 days against repeated German assaults, supported by tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers. When German forces finally broke through on 22 September, they found the defenders had fought to the last man. The floor was ankle-deep in spent shell casings. Bodies were piled in the stairwells where they died fighting. The Red October factory, the Barricady gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory became legendary killing grounds. These industrial complexes, with their massive workshops, assembly halls, and connecting tunnels, were contested meter by meter. Soviet workers fought alongside soldiers, sometimes rolling freshly assembled T-34 tanks directly from production lines into combat. Foundry workers used molten metal as a weapon, pouring it onto German attackers from upper floors. Machine shops became sniper positions. Basement boiler rooms became bunkers. One German infantryman, a clerk from Munich who had been drafted in 1940, wrote to his wife in October, "We fight for a single room for 3 days, then realize the enemy is still in the cellar below us. We throw grenades down the stairs, and they throw grenades back up. We fire through the floors, they fire through the ceilings. We can hear them breathing. We can smell them. Sometimes we can see them through cracks in the walls, but we cannot kill them all. For every Russian we kill, 2 more appear. This is not war. This is slaughter. This is madness." Pavlov's house became a symbol of Soviet resistance. Sergeant Yakov Fedorovich, a young NCO from Novgorod, led a platoon that captured a 4-story apartment building overlooking a key square on 27 September. What followed was a 58-day siege that became legendary. Fedorovich's men, Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Georgians, a true cross-section of the Soviet Union, fortified every window with sandbags and machine guns. They planted mines and barbed wire around the building's perimeter. They knocked holes through internal walls to move between rooms without exposing themselves to sniper fire. They dug a communication trench 150 meters to the Volga for supplies and reinforcements. German forces attacked repeatedly. Infantry assaults, tank-supported attacks, artillery bombardments that lasted hours. They never took the building. German propaganda later claimed that more Germans died attacking Pavlov's house than died taking Paris. While exaggerated, the claim captured something true about the savage intensity of Stalingrad's combat. A single building, properly defended, could hold up an entire regiment. By late October, both sides were exhausted. The Germans had captured most of Stalingrad's industrial district and pushed the Soviet 62nd Army into a narrow strip of ruins along the Volga, sometimes no more than a few hundred meters wide, but they couldn't deliver the final blow. Every attack gained a few meters, sometimes a single building, at enormous cost. German casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. Entire battalions were ground down to company strength, then platoon strength, then vanished entirely. Soviet losses were even higher. The 62nd Army was being bled white defending the city. Reinforcements had to be fed across the Volga under constant German artillery and air attack. Supply boats made their runs at night, navigating by the glow of burning buildings, dodging shells and Stuka attacks. Many boats never made it. The river bottom became a graveyard of sunken barges, drowned men, and lost supplies. But the Soviets had one crucial advantage. They could replace their losses. Behind the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombers, Soviet factories were producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition at an accelerating pace. Stalin could afford to lose divisions defending Stalingrad because new divisions were being trained and equipped every week. Germany, fighting on multiple fronts with a smaller population and industrial base, could not sustain the same attrition rate. And then came November. And with it, the cold. The first snow fell on 2nd November, light flurries that melted on the still warm rubble. German soldiers, many of whom had experienced the previous winter outside Moscow, felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. They remembered what Russian winter meant: frostbite, frozen weapons, vehicles that wouldn't start, supply lines cut by snow. The Wehrmacht logistics officers had promised that winter clothing was being shipped from Germany and would arrive by December. The offensive would be concluded before the worst cold set in. Both promises proved false. By late October, temperatures were dropping steadily, 10 degrees Celsius, negative 15 degrees Celsius. The Volga River began to freeze along its edges. German soldiers still wore the same uniforms they'd worn in August, standard-issue wool tunics and trousers designed for Central European weather, not Siberian cold. They had no proper winter coats, no insulated boots, no cold-weather gear beyond what they could scavenge from dead Soviet soldiers or trade with rear echelon units. Supply convoys stretched over 1,000 kilometers from Germany through Poland and across Ukraine couldn't deliver what didn't exist. Winter clothing was still being manufactured. Fuel was rationed because partisan attacks were increasing on the rail lines. Food shipments became irregular. The Luftwaffe, that had dominated the skies in August, found its sortie rates dropping as fog, snow, and freezing temperatures grounded aircraft or limited flying to a few hours per day when visibility improved. Paulus requested permission to withdraw from Stalingrad and establish a defensible winter line further west. Hitler refused. The Führer had publicly announced that Stalingrad would fall. German newsreels had shown confident soldiers raising swastika flags over captured Soviet positions. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels had described the battle as the decisive victory that would break Soviet resistance. Retreat was politically impossible. To retreat was to admit failure. Hitler would not allow it. Operation Uranus. The trap snaps shut. On 19th November 1942, Hitler's refusal became a death sentence. The attack began at dawn, though dawn was barely distinguishable from night in the fog and snow that blanketed the still frozen steppe. At 7:20 a.m., Soviet artillery opened fire along an 80-kilometer front north of Stalingrad. Over 3,500 guns and Katyusha rocket launchers, firing simultaneously, created a roar that could be heard 50 kilometers away. The barrage lasted 80 minutes, methodically destroying Romanian defensive positions, command posts, communication trenches, and supply depots. The Romanian Third Army, holding the northern flank, was ill-equipped and poorly motivated. Many Romanian soldiers saw the war as Germany's fight, not theirs. Their anti-tank guns dated from World War I and couldn't penetrate Soviet armor. Their officers had repeatedly warned German high command that their positions were vulnerable. Those warnings had been ignored. At 8:50 a.m., Soviet armor attacked. Hundreds of T-34 medium tanks and KV-1 heavy tanks emerged from the snow like steel ghosts. The T-34, with its sloped armor, wide tracks, and excellent mobility in winter conditions, was superior to most German tanks. Against Romanian anti-tank guns, it was invincible. Romanian soldiers broke and fled. Within hours, the northern front collapsed. Soviet mobile units raced southwest, bypassing German strongpoints, cutting communication lines, overrunning rear-area supply depots. The next day, 20th November, the nightmare repeated in the south. Another massive artillery barrage shattered Romanian positions south of Stalingrad. More Soviet tanks broke through. German reserves rushed to plug the gaps, but panzer divisions that should have been able to maneuver at 40 kilometers per hour found themselves crawling on fumes. Fuel supplies had been prioritized for the units fighting in Stalingrad itself. Mobile reserves had just enough fuel to reach the breakthrough points, but not enough to conduct sustained operations. On 23 November, at the town of Kalach, 40 kilometers west of Stalingrad, Soviet forces from the northern and southern pincers met. The trap snapped shut. The entire German Sixth Army, over 290,000 men, was encircled in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep. With them were remnants of Romanian divisions, Croatian auxiliaries, Luftwaffe flak battery personnel, and miscellaneous support units.
It was perhaps the most catastrophic miscalculation of the entire war. The Luftwaffe did not have 500 tons of daily airlift capacity into Stalingrad. The distances were too great, over 200 kilometers from the nearest German-held airfields. The weather was too unpredictable, with frequent blizzards, fog, and storms that grounded aircraft for days. Soviet fighters, Yak-1s, Lag-3s, and American-supplied P-39 Airacobras patrolled the air corridors relentlessly. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket with hundreds of guns. The airfields inside the pocket were under constant Soviet artillery bombardment, their runways cratered, their facilities primitive. The primary transport aircraft, the Junkers Ju-52, was a 3-engine workhorse designed for cargo and paratrooper operations. It was slow, lumbering, and defenseless. Soviet fighters hunted them mercilessly. One Soviet pilot later described it as shooting ducks. They cannot evade, they cannot fight back. They simply fly straight and hope we miss. On the best days, the airlift delivered 100 tons of supplies. On average days, perhaps 50 tons reached the pocket. On many days, storms or Soviet attacks meant nothing arrived. Over the next 10 weeks, the Luftwaffe would lose over 500 transport aircraft trying to supply the Sixth Army. Planes destroyed by fighters, by anti-aircraft fire, by crashes and blizzards, by engine failures in the extreme cold. Inside the pocket, soldiers' daily rations were cut immediately. The normal German army ration provided about 3,000 calories per day for combat soldiers. Within days of encirclement, that was reduced to 300 grams of bread, a portion smaller than a man's fist, then 200 grams. By December, 100 grams, a slice the size of a playing card. Meat disappeared. Vegetables were a memory.
Coffee became roasted acorns mixed with melted snow. Horses were slaughtered for meat. The Sixth Army had over 30,000 horses when encircled, draft animals for artillery and supply wagons. They were systematically killed and butchered. Soldiers ate horse meat boiled into thin stew. When the horses were gone, they ate anything organic they could find. Leather belts were boiled to extract whatever nutrition might exist in the hide. Soldiers chewed on grass frozen in the snow. They scraped frost from walls to drink because water supplies had frozen solid. Starvation set in with terrifying speed. A German infantryman's body, designed to operate on 3,000 calories per day during combat conditions, was receiving perhaps 700 calories. Muscle mass disappeared first as the body consumed protein for energy. Fat reserves, already depleted by months of combat, vanished entirely. Then the body began breaking down organs, the liver, kidneys, heart, to survive. Men became skeletal. Their eyes sunk into their skulls. Their skin turned gray and papery. They moved slowly, conserving every calorie because walking expended energy they couldn't replace. But the cold was worse. Much, much worse. December brought temperatures that veterans of the previous winter said they'd never experienced. Minus 30 degrees Celsius became normal. Minus 35 degrees Celsius, minus 40 degrees Celsius on the worst days. At these temperatures, the world becomes hostile to life itself. Exposed skin freezes in minutes, the tissue crystallizing as water and cells turns to ice. Breath freezes in the lungs, creating a painful crackling sensation with every inhalation. Metal becomes so cold that touching it with bare skin tears the flesh away. Weapons malfunction as lubricants thicken to sludge. Vehicle engines refuse to start, no matter how long mechanics work on them. German soldiers, still wearing their summer uniforms with perhaps one additional layer of clothing scavenged from dead comrades or stolen from rear areas, were dying of exposure by the thousands. The Wehrmacht had sent its men to fight a summer campaign. No one had seriously planned for them to be fighting in Russia in December. Frostbite became epidemic.
Sleep became a form of suicide. Soldiers knew that falling asleep in the open meant freezing to death. They huddled together for warmth in cellars and ruins, pressed body against body, sharing body heat because they had no other source of warmth. Even so, men would wake to find the soldier next to them had died during the night, frozen solid. Those who died were stripped of their clothing immediately. The living needed those extra layers more than the dead needed dignity. Fuel was so scarce that vehicles sat immobile, their engines frozen, abandoned where they'd stopped. Tanks became shelters for their crews, who huddled inside the steel hulls, which at least blocked the wind. Artillery pieces couldn't be moved. The guns sat silent because there was no fuel to tow them and no ammunition left to fire. Soldiers burned furniture, then structural beams from buildings, then anything wooden they could find. When the wood ran out, they tried burning uniforms, leather equipment, even frozen corpses soaked in precious fuel. The psychological toll was immense. Men watched their friends die slowly, not from bullets, but from starvation and cold. They listened to Soviet loudspeakers broadcasting propaganda in German, promising hot food, medical care, and survival for those who surrendered. They received letters from home that described Christmas celebrations, warm houses, families gathered around fires. Letters that described a world that no longer seemed real, that might as well have been describing life on another planet. Some men committed suicide rather than continue, a gunshot in the night, a body found hanging from a rafter. Others simply gave up, stopped eating the meager rations they received, stopped moving, and waited for death. The German word Kälteleichen emerged, the freezing ones, soldiers who had lost hope and were dying of cold but not yet dead, sitting motionless in corners, staring at nothing, waiting for the end. Christmas 1942 arrived with temperatures at negative 38 degrees Celsius. There were no celebrations, no traditional songs, no special meals.
Soldiers sat in frozen ruins and ate their 100-gram bread ration if they had been fortunate enough to receive anything from the supply flights. The Luftwaffe had attempted special Christmas packages, chocolates, cigarettes, small luxuries meant to boost morale. Less than a quarter made it through. Soviet fighters shot down several transports. Others dropped their cargo outside the pocket, where Soviet soldiers collected German Christmas packages and laughed at the luxury items, cigarettes, cognac, chocolate, meant for men who were starving. One sergeant from Hamburg wrote in his diary on Christmas night, "Christmas in hell. Schmidt died today. Just sat down against the wall during our watch and never got up. We left him there because we're too weak to move his body. Tomorrow we'll cut strips from his uniform to wrap our feet. God forgive us. God forgive Germany for sending us to this place." By early January 1943, the pocket had shrunk dramatically. Soviet forces attacked relentlessly from all sides, using massive artillery barrages, followed by infantry and tank assaults. German defenders weakened.
For hours, Paulus sat in silence. He thought of the 91,000 men still alive in the pocket, starving, freezing, waiting for orders that would never save them. He thought of the hundreds of thousands already dead, buried in shallow graves or left where they fell to be covered by snow. He thought of the promises of relief that never came, the supplies that never arrived, the support that evaporated like breath in the frozen air. At 7:35 a.m. on 2nd February, Paulus surrendered. The southern pocket laid down its weapons. 2 days later, the northern pocket surrendered as well. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 290,000 Germans encircled in November, approximately 91,000 survived to surrender. But survival was relative. They were skeletal, disease-ridden, frostbitten, and broken. Their average weight had dropped below 50 kilograms. Many could barely walk. Soviet POW camps, themselves struggling with insufficient supplies and brutal conditions, became death camps for the Germans. Over the following months and years, thousands more died from typhus, dysentery, malnutrition, and untreated frostbite injuries. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Most didn't survive past 1943. They had endured Stalingrad's hell only to die slowly in captivity. The Soviet Union counted its own catastrophic losses. An estimated 478,000 Soviet soldiers died during the battle, with over 1 million wounded. Civilian casualties approached 50,000. The city itself was obliterated. Not a single building remained structurally intact. The factories Stalin had fought so desperately to hold were twisted metal. The streets were mass graves. But the strategic impact was seismic. Germany had lost an entire army, one of its finest, most experienced forces. The Sixth Army simply ceased to exist. 22 divisions, hundreds of thousands of men who had marched confidently across Europe, were gone. The equipment losses were staggering. 900 aircraft, 1,500 tanks, 6,000 artillery pieces, 60,000 vehicles. It was a blow from which the Wehrmacht never recovered. More importantly, Stalingrad broke the myth of German invincibility. The blitzkrieg that had terrified Europe was stopped, surrounded, and destroyed, not primarily by superior tactics or heroism, but by the simple mathematics of encirclement, starvation, and cold. From Stalingrad forward, the strategic initiative belonged to the Red Army. Germany would fight desperately for 2 more years, but it would be fighting a defensive war, retreating westward, bleeding itself white in a war of attrition it could not win. Legacy. Today, 80 years later, the ruins have been rebuilt as Volgograd. Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that changed hands so many times, is crowned with "The Motherland Calls," an 85-meter statue visible for miles. Beneath that statue, in soil churned by millions of shells, workers still occasionally find relics: bullets, helmets, dog tags, bones. German and Soviet alike, they lie together in the earth, united in death. The soldiers who died in Stalingrad, German and Soviet alike, didn't die for grand strategy or ideology. They died because they were there, trapped in a battle neither side could abandon. They died because Hitler refused to retreat. They died because Goering promised supplies that never arrived. They died because no one had planned for winter. They died of hunger in a pocket that received supply flights, but never enough supplies. They died of cold because wool uniforms and summer boots couldn't protect against 40 below temperatures. Stalingrad stands as a monument not to the glory of war, but to its absolute horror. It demonstrates what happens when human beings are ground between the machines of total war and the indifference of winter. It shows that courage, training, and superior equipment mean nothing against starvation and cold. It proves that even the mightiest army can be destroyed, not by the enemy's strength, but by their own leaders' refusal to accept reality. The nightmare lasted for 199 days, and when it ended, Hitler's army was dead in the snow. But even as the last shots echoed through Stalingrad's frozen ruins, another battle was beginning, where American soldiers would face their baptism of fire against Rommel's Afrika Korps in the deserts of Tunisia. Join us next time as we uncover the story of Kasserine Pass, where the U.S. Army learned that war is not won by courage alone, but by blood, experience, and the hardest lessons imaginable.